Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending where you are on this fast forward planet, which is wrapped in so many layers of turbulent change, complexity that I've stopped counting them. There are the viruses are coming back into the mix of things to think about, along with war and politics. Hantavirus and Ebola are making headlines. We have such a nice, high functioning public health system in this country now. I can't wait to see how that plays out. Luckily, I don't think either of those is going to be a significant threat here. This is Andy Revkin. This is Sustain What? It's like year six. I've done maybe 800 of these things with about 1,500 guests. And today we're going to dive into the climate arena. I led off my post on this today by saying few concepts in climate science have been more deeply hidden in the weeds and more consequential than the scenarios for planet heating emissions that have been long used by climate modelers and policymakers to figure out our warming future and what to do about it. You have to start somewhere with pictures. We kind of know where we've been, but where we're going is based on projections and analysis of all kinds of data sets for societal dynamics and technological dynamics and climate dynamics. And it's implicitly multidimensional, it's multidisciplinary, and there have long been questions about these tracks that have been used as sort of baselines for how to think about heating of the planet and what that means for us in terms of options for survivability and change. And RCP8.5 became this token. It's a very complex, it hides a lot of complex history, that number, letters and numbers. And we're going to get into the reality today, which partially was spurred by some guy named Donald Trump, or at least his social media person. There's a woman in the White House who is the main, his sort of, she controls the spigot to a certain extent on his dynamics there. And he posted about this number, which I'm sure he has no freaking clue about. And he said, "Good riddance after 15 years of Democrats promising that climate change is going to destroy the planet. The United States top climate committee, the United States top, or the United Nations, the IPCC, just admitted its own projections were wrong, far too long, climate activism, blah, blah, blah." And, but this issue of this scenario has been discussed intensively the last 5-6 years, starting with in 2017 with a paper by Justin Ritchie, and then going forward, it's eroded the sense of the value of thinking of that emission scenario as being something that could happen in the real world. And the people who are on the screens right now have been involved in this discussion for a long time. At the very last second, we were joined by Richard Tol, who's a climate researcher in the UK. Richard, I'm blanking on, are you Exeter or are you East Anglia? I can't remember. Just nod.
Sussex.
Sussex, I'm wrong in so many ways. And we hold on. We have, let me just get my notes here. This came together really quickly, which is one reason it's also a mantle or a reflection of the Manthropocene. We have Matthew.
Matt, unless you're my mother. So Matt Burgess.
Yeah, Andy, unless you're my mother too. Matt Burgess, University of Wyoming. We have Roger Pielke Jr., formerly, emeritus, University of Colorado Boulder, now at the American Enterprise Institute. Zeke Hausfather, who is a longtime climate researcher at the company Stripe, which manages the financial back end of this Substack thing, among many others, but is interested in climate in many ways. It doesn't want to have a big impact on the climate system.
Yeah.
And you're also
at Berkeley Earth. Yeah,
I was just going to say, and at Berkeley Earth. So I'm going to just kind of switch to that screen. And again, to those who keep track of things like gender, I apologize for the maleness and the whiteness and everything else about the array of people, but we are who we are. So I wanted to start with, let's see, who do we start with? Richard. You're not going to start with Richard because you're the grayer of the graybeards here. I think you might be older than me. I just turned 70. How old are you?
I am 56, I
Oh my
think.
Lord. So I really am the old, I'm the old, oh geez. I just want to go fishing. Sorry. But in the climate arena, in terms of the IPCC and the rest, you're someone I've known forever, and your economics analysis and your sort of systemic approach to these questions is really valuable. And you're not one of the sort of prime combatants here, maybe. So could you just give a quick review from your stand what this RCP erosion and now elimination is about?
It is really about the revolution in the energy sector, right? So the RCPs are actually quite old. They go back to 2005, right? That's 20 years ago. I've been lecturing on the economics of climate change for a long time. And if I go back to my first edition of my textbook or my old slides, then I always told my students that wind and solar works technically, and there's no physical limits to how much energy we could, there's of course physical limits, but we could get enough energy from wind and sun. But it's just hugely expensive, right? That is what I think as a community was more or less the consensus 20 years ago. And that is how you should see the RCPs, right? They go back a long, long time. And it was, at that time, it was pretty, because the shale revolution in oil and gas was just starting. So people really were wondering what would happen if we run out of conventional oil and gas. And solar and wind and other renewables didn't look that promising at that time. And shale looked like a pipe dream. So a number of people were seriously thinking, and this actually goes back earlier than that, but around 2005 when the RCP scenarios were created, some people were still thinking in these terms, that the only way to supply the world with enough energy is to go back to coal. That is to go for coal gasification, go for coal liquefaction, and that is how we would run the energy system. Now that was, I think, still somewhat respectable in 2005 when these scenarios were created. Mm-hmm. But now in 2026, it is completely ridiculous to think that coal gasification could ever compete, or that just burning coal for electricity, let alone liquefying coal to drive your car or your tank with, would ever compete with renewables and biofuels and all those sort of things. But unfortunately, because these groups that create these scenarios and sort of endorse these scenarios move very, very, very slowly, much more slowly than, in this case, the revolution in the energy supply. For a very long time, we were stuck with these scenarios. And it's a good thing that is now finally turning around. Because some of the scenarios in sort of the energy scenarios in RCP 8.5 are ridiculous. I never realized just how ridiculous until I read Justin Ritchie's work, right?
Right, and here it is.
Where it's sort of like the only way to get enough coal for that scenarios was to go dig it up in Antarctica, which is probably technically feasible if you put your mind to it, but so hideously expensive, right? So hideously expensive that it would just never be economical, right? So yeah, I'm glad. I'm glad that the scenario is gone. It should have died around 2010, I think, rather than around 2026.
And Roger, I want to go to you next, and then Zeke and onward. Roger, you've been at this a very long time too, and you started to jump into this. Well, you've been involved in this question of these scenarios for as long as back to 2017 and even earlier, I think. Uh, and you've also written about the slowness of the system catching up with these issues. So, what do you think has been at play from your standpoint, and why this took so long? And even now, there are still papers being published using this scenario.
Yeah, thanks. It's good to be with everybody. Yeah, our first scenario paper was actually 2008, and I think our first paper that looked at the RCP 8.5 was 2015. Although all credit to Justin Ritchie, who was on top of this before anybody else. Hadi was his PhD advisor, and he did his PhD thesis on this topic, which is fantastic. Richard hit the nail on the head that the biggest issue here is not that we got things wrong in scenarios. Scenarios are scenarios, and most of them will not anticipate how the world actually turns out. The big problem here was the long time frame of self-correction that it took. If you go back, it's fine that people didn't accept Justin's paper at first. Justin gave an interview, I think 2021 with Bloomberg, where he mentioned that he had to go to 5 or 6 journals, had more than 30 reviews of that paper, because his belief is that it wasn't welcome in the literature because the RCPs and SSPs were brand new, and who wants the guy to show up and tell you that they're already out of date? And so the assumptions, Richard characterized it very well. The assumptions go back actually to the 1980s, 1990s. The RCP 8.5 isn't actually RCP 8.5. That's just a name that was slapped on it. It comes from the message integrated assessment model. Before that, it was the A2 scenario of the IPCC in 2000. Then it was the A2R scenario in 2007. All of which were built on this assumption. And let me say, the issues here aren't just RCP 8.5. All of the RCPs and SSPs are built on the theoretical foundation that Richard just outlined, that there's an assumption that the world's going to return to coal. The new high scenario that was just released, which to the credit of the scenario group, is characterized as a what-if exercise, not as a baseline or a reference scenario. In the paper, they say, this is based on an assumption of a return to coal, and we don't know if there's enough resources out there. Maybe we would go to Antarctica or haul an asteroid close by and get the coal. So the fundamental flaw that, and literally, there's thousands of scenarios out there that the IPCC collects, and if you take a look at them, almost all of them, thousands of scenarios have a common underlying assumption of increasing coal consumption. And that's a single point of failure there. So, the whole episode, what we should take from it is it's important to update scenarios more than every decade or 15 years. In climate science, particularly climate modeling, there is a need to freeze scenarios so that you can spend the years necessary to do computationally intensive work. But for the needs of policy, you need scenarios updated ideally on an annual basis. And so the idea we could kill 2 birds with 1 stone, we could have the same set of scenarios for wonky scientific research and the same set of scenarios for policy applications, probably was a mistake. The last thing I'll say, and turn it over to others, is that originally, if you go back to the original first IPCC assessment, it had 4 scenarios. Nobody much cared about them. They were A, B, C, and D. At some point, Justin and I, in our paper, our incredibly long, boring paper on the history of all this, we quote a researcher who says, we didn't realize that RCPs could take on a life of their own. These scenarios escaped from the courtyard of science and went out in the real world. And it turns out they're used in policy, they're used in regulation, they're used in global banking, they're used in insurance rate setting and risk assessment. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that everyone on the planet is in some way touched by these scenarios. And so the institutions of science really didn't keep up with the growing importance of climate change as a topic and climate institutions. And so here we are in 2026. And like Richard said, better late than never, but it would have been better if it happened 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah, and I want to get into the issue of the media here too, and the science committee, but we'll circle back to that. So Zeke, let's get to you and everyone. Today on Substack on the Climate Brink, which Zeke co-manages and co-writes with Andrew Dessler. He has a post, his post deep dive onto the death of RCP 8.5. And if Trump has done nothing else, he spurred a lot of people to weigh in afresh on this issue. So Zeke,
Yeah,
explain your background too, a little bit like Richard did.
yeah. The post you're showing today is also with Glenn Peters, who I wrote the 2020
Yeah.
Nature piece with, and Piers Foster, who's a climate scientist in the UK. But as a little bit background, I've been sort of started out as a hobbyist in the climate science world circa 2010. Eventually went back to get my PhD around 2015, primarily in observational temperature records, but also have done a lot of work on scenarios and sort of climate model observation comparison. But on the question of RCP 8.5, I think there's a surprising amount, that some of the watchers of this or some of the watchers of this would be surprised at just how much the people here agree on the basics, even though Roger and I like to spar online a lot. There's a couple things that I think we'd all agree are true today. One is that, RCP 8.5 was never a particularly plausible baseline scenario. And there was a mistake by the community to refer to it as business as usual. I like to call it a mistaken game of telephone. I don't think there was a bad intent there. I think that a lot of climate scientists didn't necessarily read the energy modeling literature, which made it pretty clear back in 2011 when RCP 8.5 was formally published that it was intended to represent the 90th percentile of baseline outcomes in the literature at the time, not a particular likely outcome. And even though the paper that originally published it used the phrase a conservative business as usual scenario, talking to the author of that paper, they emphasized that they did not intend it to reflect business as usual, or certainly the most plausible business as usual world. And I think at the same time, as Richard noted, the world has changed remarkably in the last 2 decades. When these scenarios came out, global emissions had increased 30% in just 10 years. Global coal use was skyrocketing. It was probably a mistake to assume it could continue to increase at that rate, but it's also notoriously hard to predict the future. I remember going back to some of the early years of the energy modeling community. YASA back in the 1980s had these great scenarios where the world would be 80% nuclear by the year 2000. Right. Would have been nice if it happened. It obviously didn't. And so I think there's sort of 2 separate questions that we've been debating a lot here. One is, how plausible was the scenario ever? And I think we all agree it was pretty implausible. And the second is, has the world actually moved away from higher emission scenarios? On that latter question, I think the answer is probably yes, driven in part by, as Richard pointed out, the falling cost of clean energy, which is mediated obviously by some policy actions taken by various countries, including the US, China, and others. Exactly where we might have been headed, I think, is a really tough question to answer. It's one we try to dig into in this paper, looking at what, the range of baseline scenarios published at the time were, where folks like the IEA and Climate Action Tracker expected us to go. But it's ultimately proving it counterfactual. It's hard to know. I think that a world where global CO2 emissions doubled by the end of the century was probably within the realm of possibility, certainly 10 or 15 years ago, even if a world where they tripled, which RCP 8.5 envisioned, was not. And then the final thing I'll say is, I think there definitely were some missed opportunities to fix this before now. In some ways, this is the first generation of scenarios that has come out after there was widespread criticism of 8.5 in the literature. The SSPs had already come out in 2017 when Justin's paper came out criticizing the scenario. And at the same time, they should have done better. SSP5 8.5, which was RCP 8.5's sort of successor in the SSPs, was always a weird chimera of a scenario. It was a world that was incredibly prosperous, high-tech, advanced, equal, that burned all the fossil fuels because they could. At least RCP 8.5 told what at the time was a bit more coherent story about incredibly high population growth and low technological progress that one could imagine leading to a world of high coal consumption. By the time the SSPs came around, even that scenario couldn't generate an 8.5 watt per meter squared forcing scenario anymore. And so there was a desire for continuity to keep a high forcing scenario for modelers to use, which is understandable. but a lot more could have been done then to make it clear that these high-end scenarios should be deprioritized by the community and certainly not referred to as business as usual.
Yeah, I do want to get back to that business as usual misinterpretation, but not quite yet. I want Matthew to dive in here a little bit first, because that's where the media and the environmental groups, I think, and some activist scientists did a disservice to the arena by conflating those things intentionally, or at least without careful scrutiny. So Matthew, University of Wyoming, describe your background a little bit and then dive into why you felt you needed to post after the president did his fascinating.
Yeah, sure. So I actually started out as an econ major, became an ecologist, did my PhD in ecology, but took pretty much all the classes you take to get a PhD in applied economics at the same time. And I had co-advisor who was Stephen Pulaski, who's an economist. And then I kind of gradually over the next decade became an economist. Now I'm an economics professor. And originally my interest was kind of mathematical bioeconomics, which really has nothing to do with climate change. And then I got interested originally in the scenarios because I got really interested in pessimistic GDP per capita growth scenarios that were coming out. People like Robert Gordon were popularizing in his book, The Rise and Fall of American Growth. I became, pretty convinced that at least in the medium term, that's a strong thesis. I thought it was an angle on the growth degrowth debate that people weren't really paying attention to in ecological economics. And then I got into the scenarios actually by arguing with Roger about Robert Gordon's book. We were colleagues in environmental studies, and he wrote a very scathing review on his blog about the rise and fall of American growth. And so we're sort of, I can't remember if it was an email or a hallway discussion or both, where I was just like, I think this is wrong. And then Roger wrote a Forbes column about where he did a back of the envelope IPAT analysis, retrospective analysis on the scenarios, and found that the emissions we had been talking about coal with Justin Ritchie's work, but in retrospectively, the main thing that was keeping the emissions lower than the scenarios historically was GDP per capita growth was slower. And so I remember sending him an email, something to the effect of, see, this is what I've been trying to convince you of. And so that's kind of how I got interested in, and we ended up writing a couple of papers with Justin. And then separately, I've also just been interested in the political polarization, particularly of environmental issues. And that started with basically coming of age academically in the mid to late 2010s, where it felt like everybody was talking about climate change like it's a problem that requires all of society to transform over decades, but only the leftmost third of the Democrats can be trusted to do anything about it, and they're the only ones worth talking to. And I was like, well, that doesn't make any sense, the theory of change. So, what are we doing about that? And so, I would say I got interested a little bit in some of the maybe political media aspects of the scenario discussion, just because to my eye, it exemplified maybe a little bit some of the blind spots that we have in academia writ large about, the kind of equivalent of Michael Jordan's mantra of Republicans buy sneakers too, right? Republicans consume science too. And it seemed like this was an area of where we maybe could have moved faster in correcting, even though I agree with Zeke that most of the scenario misuse is innocent. And certainly in fisheries, my experience has been that people actually have updated pretty quickly. But I think there's also been a little bit of a hunkering down and circle the wagons. And, we want to talk about climate politics in sometimes literally Tolkien terms, right? And I just don't think that that's been particularly helpful for trust in science. And I think this is a symptom of that. And it's hard to see, I think, because, the president of the United States is tweeting so intemperately about it, right? And so kind of hyperbolically about it and somewhat absurdly about it. I think it's easy to miss the fact that circling the wagons isn't actually helping our cause. But also, I think it's easy to miss. This is another bugbear I have, maybe a little bit on both sides. Is it's easy to miss how actually off of the median Republican the president's climate views are, right? He basically won an election that was fought on non-climate issues, And he happens to have this personal view that's kind of way out there, even for the Republicans, on climate. Yeah. And so I think that there's, taking what he tweets as sort of representative of what everybody thinks about the community and the policy, I think is actually not true, and circling the wagons is not helpful.
Although just while we know there's many Republicans who think it's not true, he has done a great job of silencing them through grotesque intimidation at the same time. So it's not surprising the public would have this perception that you just described, because he's completely throttled that party.
I mean, it's not surprising the public would have this perception for a number of reasons, right? I mean, if the president of the United States is tweeting something, it's, the public's default prior, understandably, is going to be that he represents whatever his government, says in that. But I think I have a post on my Substack called something like something about, I'm trying to remember the title. It's basically about progress will continue on climate change will continue under the second Trump administration, despite the vibe shift. One of the things that's interesting is that, first of all, a lot of the big drivers of reduction in U.S. emission are outside of the White House. So, we've basically had a linear decline in U.S. greenhouse gas emissions since the second George W. Bush administration, with a little uptick largely caused by data centers in the last year. And so a lot of that's, going on in the private sector. And, if you want to kill coal or save coal, you kind of can't get it off the, steady decline. And same thing with oil. And there's also some interesting maneuvering behind the scenes, right? So, for example, the president's budget request was pretty disastrous for OAR. I used to be in an institute at University of Colorado Boulder that's funded by OAR, series, which is a great institute. So I've watching that pretty closely. I care about my colleague, what's going on with my colleagues, former colleagues, and so White House budget request was pretty disastrous for them. And then the one big beautiful bill was, I think, a little bit less disastrous for them. And then what was actually passed by Congress was not that disastrous at all for them. Now there's this whole fight about Office of Management and Budget, right? Are they releasing the money or not? But I guess I'm just using that as an example to illustrate similar things with other kind of science funding. The White House budget request and the congressional appropriations are very different. That it is true that there's a lot of party discipline enforced by the president in some areas, but I think the reality on the ground is a little bit more complicated than just everybody goes along with whatever the president says.
Okay, Roger, you're a deep student of this, the politics of this. Do you think functionally is the Republican Party basically paralyzed until Trump is not president anymore?
Yeah, I got asked last summer. I was invited to Oslo, Norway. I had spent a sabbatical at the University of Oslo, and I was invited to give a talk to explain what's going on in American science to Norwegians. And my first response was, well, if I can figure that out, I'll come tell you. But I mean, one of the things I opened with was to be careful. There's not a legacy Democratic or Republican Party anymore. Republicans in particular, the MAGA Republicans are not Republicans. And so, whether you call them never Trumpers or, the legacy Mitt Romney, George H.W. Bush wing of the party, they're on the outside looking in. The party of international collaboration, of free trade, it's not recognizable now. The Democrats have had their own split between their progressive wing and the I say that the centrist Democrat is an endangered species. If we can find the centrist Democrats, maybe that'll help on that side. So American politics is all mixed up right now. I don't think that the Trump administration actually has anything resembling a science policy. No. I call it a vengeance campaign. What they've done to the National Science Board, what they've done to NCAR, National Center for Atmospheric Research here in Boulder. I spent 10 years there at the start of my career. It's a great institution. It's really hard to identify, what they're doing to public health. It's very hard to identify a strategy there other than we don't like these people. Trump's tweet about climate change. On the one hand, he must like this, some climate research. And maybe it's just climate research. Maybe it's just the climate research he can put a tweet out about. So I really think it's a difficult period for science policy, for climate policy. I do wonder if in January 2029, whoever wins, the collective political mood, whether it's a Marco Rubio or Gavin Newsom, is like, well, that was weird these last 13 years, and things go back to, more or less the way they were before. But on the other hand, if you take a look at the longer term trends, set aside Trump, the decline of the U.S. Congress in terms of its power with respect to the executive branch has been a long time phenomenon. It's been many decades.
Yeah.
One of my favorite books from grad school was James Sundquist's the Rise and Decline of Congress. And so over the 250 years of this country, Congress has waxed and waned in terms of its power. The last time Congress asserted a lot of power was after Watergate. So one thing to pay attention to is if the Congress in 2029 decides, all right, we had enough of this imperial presidency. So who knows? I'm a big fan of Article 1 of the Constitution. And I don't care if it's a Democrat or Republican. I'd love to see the U.S. Congress assert itself more on all these topics. But we'll see. We're not in that phase yet.
One just quick point, Andy, if I may.
Yeah.
The greatest lie that both extremes in the United States tell everybody else is that they're the solution to the other extreme, when in fact they're politically each other's best friends. Because if you see, for example, independent identification is way up, right, in the last decade. Most Americans fit into what people call the exhausted majority. And they kind of go along with one side or the other because they're, basically whoever negative polarization, whoever they're more scared of, right? So if they're more scared of, what went on in the summer of 2020, maybe they vote for Trump, right? Or if they're more scared of what's going on, in the last 6 months in the streets of Minneapolis, maybe, they vote for AOC or whoever, right? And so I think whichever party figures out that dynamic and nominates, a relative moderate is going to clean up in the next election, with the caveat that, again, whether or not this is right, I think there's some evidence for a desire to move a little bit to the right of where we've been in the last decade among the public. So, for example, polls had Nikki Haley beating any Democrat, but moderate Democrats could beat more extreme Republicans, and vice versa. If that makes sense. Again, that's a claim of fact, not a claim of norms or anything.
To bring this just really quick, to bring this back to the question of climate science, I think that the broader and growing politicization in the U.S. has also led to an increased politicization of climate science itself. There's a great quote from 20 years ago now from Stephen Schneider that, when it comes to the media representation of climate change, it's, the end of the world are good for us. And in his view, those are the two least likely outcomes. And I feel like it's only grown worse since then, right? I really look forward to having a politics where we can have, sane adult conversations about challenging risk management problems like climate change without going to these extremes.
I couldn't agree more. The reason I showed that horseshoe a minute ago is just earlier today, I was looking at horseshoe theory, which is that the ends of the curve of who we think we are tend to come together, and they're farther from the middle than they are from each other.
Anti-Semitism, I think, is the quintessential example of that.
Yeah. Well, and just look at I can go down the list. Maha. I know people in Maha who are both ends of the spectrum of what we think of as political position. Now we're going to get into the question I think that's dividing some people here a little bit, of why 8.5 is no longer plausible, whether it was a function of history, technology change, politics, green technology, or something else. But I want to precede that. I want to show this. Hold on, where is it here? Give me a second here. Present, right? Oh, here we go. I got to know Holger Rogner when I spent a week at IASA a long time ago, and got to know that whole gang. And the work of Holger Rogner sticks in my head in terms of what we think of as policy driven versus just sort of on a long time scale, something different. And I'm going to show you. I'm trying to get him to update it. This is the carbon intensity of primary energy since the year 1800. And it kind of like just goes and goes and goes. And you don't really see a lot of policy levers there. So, and here's a little, I showed this slide sometimes about humility. Are we all just yammering around something that's playing out in ways that are beyond our, some kind of knob-like control? Oh, and Jesse Osabel told me this a long time ago. Whoops, it went too fast. Politicians are mostly pulling on disconnected levers. So I'm kind of a skeptic on this. Someone has to really demonstrate to me cause and effect, just because of these kinds of realities that I've looked at for a long time. And so maybe Zeke first, and then Roger, we can talk about attribution. Why is the attribution question always so hard? So Zeke, I know you guys have been kind of going at each other on your keyboards, but let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So I think to start out, there are many reasons why the 8.5 watt per meter squared scenarios are implausible, regardless of your views of how policy has changed. To the point brought up earlier, mining coal in Antarctica is probably pretty unlikely, though. My YASA mentor was always Arnulf Grubler, and he instilled in me, that we shouldn't underestimate our ability to extract fossil fuels in the future, given how often we have underestimated it in the past. But that being aside, I think those very high-end scenarios were never particularly unlikely. And I do think there is a strong case to be made that something has changed, particularly in the last 20 years. Even in that plot you showed earlier showing CO2 emissions and temperature, if you squint at the last 10 years, CO2 emissions have plateaued. They've grown a fraction of 1% a year, but they've been more or less flat since 2013. And there are a bunch of different drivers of that, but I think part of it is the very large ramp up in global spending on clean energy technologies. Most of the electricity generation being built worldwide today is non-carbon emitting. We still are obviously burning a lot of coal and gas in particular, but even with oil, 25% of new cars sold in the last quarter globally were electric. There is a technological revolution happening that's driven by the dramatic cost declines in wind and solar, cost declines that, I think many people who've been in this space for a long time would admit were a lot faster than many of us anticipated would happen, 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah.
How attributable that is to policy is always a debate. And it sort of gets to the thorny question of what is policy? Like, is policy the US National Labs or Bell Labs deciding to, invest in R&D and solar panels in the 50s and 70s? Is policy, the German feed-in tariffs or the Chinese, massive industrial scale development of clean energy in recent years as an export industry and to reduce their reliance on foreign energy sources? I mean, yes, to an extent. It's also a story of innovation. It's a story of private sector companies, driving down costs. It's hard to really disentangle technology and policy, and I think it's a bit of a fool's errand to try. What I do think we should avoid, and I know Roger's been critical of this before, is picking a particular political point, like the Paris Agreement, and saying, this changed the world in this dramatic way. Because to be honest, if we hadn't agreed on Paris, we probably would have seen a bit less domestic climate action in different ways for different countries, but it was always a volunteer agreement, and mostly countries just committing to do what they'd already decided to do anyway. Right. I think it was a codification of existing trends and actions rather than a novel thing. But last year we spent $2.3 trillion globally, according to BNEF and the IEA, on clean energy technologies writ large. That's up from, 500 billion, 6 or 7 years before, or a decade before. It's really been a fairly dramatic change. And I think we should not underestimate that.
Yeah, I'm showing a graph from your latest post as well. People should look at the climate brink. Richard, you raised your hand, and then we'll get to Roger.
Yeah, I don't disagree with Zeke, but I think there were a couple of things where policy actually mattered and mattered quite a bit. I mean, there's thousands upon thousands of climate policies. Most of them don't do much. Some of them just cost money. Some of them actually increase emissions. But there's been a few interventions, not necessarily climate policy interventions, that actually did change the course of energy history, right? So if we, I mean, Zeke is absolutely right that what is currently driving the system is the rapid decline in the costs, the relative costs of wind and solar. Now, if you look at wind, how did that get so cheap, right? Actually, there were two policy interventions there that made this happen. One was straight after the second oil crisis, the Danes decided that they wanted to build wind turbines, and the Danish government funded a program of research in how to actually make this happen, and they kept it up for decades, right? And then the German Minister for the Environment, Justin Ritchie, decided to spend an enormous amount of money on this. An enormous amount of German taxpayers' money was spent essentially on buying down the cost curve, right? And there's sort of this rule of thumb that for every doubling of the capacity that is installed, costs come down by 18 or 20% or so. And essentially, Ritchie just spent an enormous amount of money to buy that cost curve down. And that sort of got things rolling. For solar, I'm a bit less familiar with the history, but my understanding is that this actually goes back to the Carter White House, who started in response to the oil crisis, a program on research into solar that sort of like was on the back burner for a long time until it finally hit the big time, right? So we can point to a couple of crucial points where people decided to invest in this technology and keep on investing in this technology, even though it was not profitable, and even though definitely in Germany's case, it cost an awful lot of money. And that really changed the course of renewable industry. But at the same time, there's all sorts of other climate policies that are just affecting things at the margin, if that, right? It is not the case that policy is not important, right?
Yeah. Roger, going to get to you in a second, but the one thing I might propose adding to that list was Dick Cheney and natural gas and the everything that led to the deregulation that allowed shale gas to become a dominant player.
Absolutely, but shale gas sort of came truly out of the private sector, right? As far as I know, there wasn't much government intervention there, but
well, a little at the beginning. That's the whole Breakthrough Institute did a whole big thing on the early days of shale research.
Yeah, some of the technologies that were instrumental came out of national labs and R&D efforts, but a lot of it was private sector driven too.
Yeah, and there are some good questions coming in, so I want to get to those in a minute too. And Roger, I know you have to leave at the turn of the hour, so let me turn it over to you for a bit.
Yeah, well, let me just say, as a policy professor, I love this. I taught policy evaluation for years, and as these guys have said, I agree completely. It's really tricky trying to tease out the impact of policies, particularly on complicated issue where technologies change over time. There's background rates of change and so on. People argue over policy impact on all sorts of topics. One famous one I have my students look at is, does adding more lanes to a highway improve traffic or make it worse? And there's a contested literature there. If you take a look at the corporate average fuel economy standards in the US that were put into effect in the 1970s, they've clearly driven improvements in automobile fuel economy. They also have changed in ways that were not anticipated, the mix of cars on the road. Because some vehicles were there and some weren't. So we get a lot more pickup trucks and minivans and things like that. If you take a look at the recent EPA carbon dioxide related regulations that the Trump administration was so against, and you actually compare those to the CAFE standards, what they imply is basically a continued linear rate of improvement that we've seen since the 1970s. So I'd argue that that policy has become politicized, not because of what it does to the automobile fleet, but because it's associated with climate change. If it was just an improvement of CAFE standards, nobody cares about cafe standards. That's not particularly politicized these days. So I guess the big thing I'll say about climate policy, my favorite metric for big picture policy evaluation is decarbonization, which is a technical term that means carbon dioxide emissions per unit of GDP. And I call this the most interesting straight line. It's a downward sloping straight line from the 1960s to present. The decarbonization of the global economy has proceeded almost in linear fashion for 60 years, as far as we have data going back.
That kind of is consistent with what Ragnar did on primary energy.
Yeah, I mean, it's similar. The rate of change is small, and so if global climate policy, and it could be the Paris Agreement or the cumulative adding up of policies at the nation state or county or city level, add those all up, they haven't altered that trajectory. And so my hypothesis is a lot of the wonderful things that have happened, and it's true, technologies have advanced, costs have gone down, but they are basically maintaining a trend that's been in place long before Paris, long before Kyoto, long before the Rio conference. So we're calling climate policy the sort of things that we used to call other names. And that's it. Yeah. And this is for the US. It's the same globally. There are some differences around the world. If we want to have deep decarbonization at a rate faster than this linear decline, this curve is going to have an inflection point. It's that simple. If we want to maintain this curve, it's going to take a lot of work. It doesn't come for free. It's going to involve government policies. It's going to involve private sector innovation. This curve, if you extend it out in the future, just in kind of a dumb extension, we get to net zero in something like the 2080s. And it implies something like a 2.2, 2.4 degree temperature change by 2100. So I evaluate climate policies, whether they're at the national or global level, in terms of what do they do to this curve? Do they accelerate it, or do they keep it where it's at, or do they reverse it? And we've seen reversals like in China in the 2000s. Right. And so for me, evaluating policy is probably more important than evaluating scenarios, because scenarios aren't policy, and they can build in policy, but if they're not in the real world, they don't do very much.
Yeah. Now I want to get to some questions from the folks watching. There's some good ones. Let's see here. Holly J says, can you say something about whether releases of methane from the Arctic could get toward RCP 8.5-ish levels of forcing? So I guess that's, emissions begetting more emissions. Not maybe Zeke, and then Matthew, and then others.
So just quick on that, RCP 8.5 was originally a concentration scenario. The scenarios we have now are primarily emission scenarios, but there is a number of assumptions that go from translating those emissions into then a level of radiative forcing, and then that level of radiative forcing into a temperature response. So between the emissions and the radiative forcing are carbon cycle feedbacks. So essentially how changes in the ocean's ability to uptake CO2 and the biosphere's ability to uptake CO2 affects what portion of our emissions remain in the atmosphere. And that is uncertain. We expect it to weaken under higher emission scenarios, but exactly how much could vary a lot. And then beyond that radiative forcing, when we go to warming, there's a whole bunch of different feedbacks in the climate system. Permafrost is an interesting one, is that it sort of is ambiguous whether you'd consider it to be a carbon cycle feedback or a sort of climate, like a feedback to radiative forcing change, because it also directly affects radiative forcing itself. I'd probably put it more in the carbon cycle feedback category, or methane cycle feedback. It is fairly uncertain. At least in AR6, it was more significant under high scenarios of warming, where you get above 3 degrees or so than lower ones, because it sort of responds pretty non-linearly. It's not like the whole permafrost thaws at once. You have lower latitude areas thawing faster than higher latitude areas, south-facing slopes thawing faster than north-facing slopes, and you have growing vegetation in regions sort of counterbalancing some of that additional CO2 and methane release. So it's complicated, but I think it's more of a concern for high emission scenarios and sort of goes in this bucket of, the big uncertainties in the climate system that, discussions around emissions don't necessarily fully cover.
Andy, let me jump in on that point. Yeah. There's been some responses to the retirement of RCP 8.5 most notably in the Dutch Meteorological Institute, where they say, well, our Earth system models might not adequately consider these factors like Zeke talks about. So therefore, we need a more extreme socioeconomic scenario, like an RCP 8.5, to force those higher levels. And I guess my response, I'm very sympathetic to those sorts of arguments, but you fix those concerns in your Earth system models, not by purposely adopting a flawed socioeconomic scenario.
Yeah.
Two wrongs don't make a right in this case. So
No,
there's no argument to say we should keep RCP 8.5 because our physical Earth system models might be flawed. That doesn't work.
Richard,
I've heard the same argument as Roger, and I have the same response, because these emission scenarios don't just function as emission scenarios. They also function as scenarios that tell you how societies evolve, how vulnerability to climate change evolves, and you cannot just mess with socioeconomic scenarios because your Earth system models are not right, not incomplete. That is just a very bad reason. And it's not that you then have canceling errors, but you actually introduce other errors further down the system.
And just a very quick add-on to that, which I think is a really important point. One of the things that I've seen sometimes in climate economics in the last few years is you take RCP 8.5 or SSP 8.5's emissions and projected climate change, and you pair it with the slow growth economic scenarios, which I actually agree are more realistic than the SSP 5. I've written papers about this, but you can't put those two things together because one assumes more energy demand than the other thing can create, and you have this Franken scenario that combines the worst climate change and the worst adaptation and preparedness in a way that's quite misleading.
Franken scenario, I like that. I hadn't heard that term. Yeah, and I think what you're saying to me implies, rather than putting in a fudge, you're talking about a fudge factor. Sort of, if you saying, well, we know things we know what we don't know, therefore we need to make this number higher. That doesn't feel sensible to me at all.
And there are other ways around that, right? Two options are: one, you could just sample from the climate models with higher sensitivity under a more realistic emission scenario. Mm-hmm. So like even under, the new medium scenario, there's a couple climate models that get to 4 degrees C because they have really high climate sensitivity and carbon cycle feedbacks. And you're probably actually going to get a more realistic climate response from those than the average of the models in an unrealistic emission scenario. The second approach that I've been pushing for a while in both the AR6 and the most recent US National Climate Assessment is this idea of looking at global warming levels. So like what happens across different parts of the climate system at 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees, acknowledging there are many different ways to get to those global warming levels across emission scenarios and climate sensitivities and carbon cycle feedbacks. I think both are acceptable approaches and better than using a implausible emission scenario as a proxy for other climate factors.
Yeah. Now, Roger, before you go, and I want to get each of you to weigh in on this. I don't want to let the media off the hook here, or at least the interface between the media, activists, and some scientists, including even historically some of the leadership of the IPCC. There's this thing I call narrative capture. This is the warning sign I post periodically on social media. And narrative capture is when you're oblivious to new facts because your narrative is either so compelling or you're so stuck on it because of your orientation, progressive or otherwise. And I see that as a big problem here, including as Roger has shown, quantified the number of studies using this, centering with the conclusions on RCP 8.5. I think you said it's actually more now than it was a little while ago. So how big a deal is this issue of the inertia that results when we all kind of are stuck on something that, for whatever reason, for a certain community of influencers within this space, they can't let go? Maybe
as I said, I'm going to peel off here. I got another call at the top of the hour, but I'll say a couple things about this. And we've talked about this a lot over the years, Andy. De Volkskrant in the Netherlands did something that I think is really impressive. They went back through their coverage of climate, and they actually assessed how many of the stories that we published were based on studies that relied primarily on RCP 8.5. And they came up with a number, 54. And that was good accountability journalism. I can tell you from a personal perspective, for a long time, reporters at major outlets wouldn't talk to me because of our work on RCP 8.5. I can tell you today, I had a long interview with the New York Times climate reporter, maybe for the first time since Andy left. And so I do think there is a narrative out there, and working through the implications of the retirement of RCP 8.5 is going to be a big deal. And the journalists I talked to at the Times asked me, what should I be telling my readers? And I said, well, you have a tough job, because, I didn't know if it was him or other people, but the New York Times has been among the outlets that most promote the most extreme results from studies on RCP 8.5. And now telling people, well, actually, those are more, what if exercises and thought experiments than reference scenarios or baseline scenarios, sometimes called business as usual. So I do think the current media environment is going to go through some changes. But the good news is Zeke has a great Substack. Matt has a great Substack. I don't know if Richard's on there yet. We'll have to get him out there.
It's also
all right.
very good. Tall tales.
Yeah. All right. Richard's on there too. And so for people who really want to learn, what's what, it takes some work. I mean, you got to triangulate between all of the stuff that we say, and sometimes we agree on big issues and disagree on small issues, or vice versa. But I think it's a good time for people who want to know something. It's a really bad time if you just rely on your favorite Wall Street Journal, New York Times, whatever it happens to be, because it's challenging.
It is. And Roger, thanks for coming on. We had, by the way, this got set up in literally 2.5 hours ago. So I appreciate all of you taking the time out of your days and nights to be here. If you guys can hang in for another couple of minutes, that would be great.
Yeah,
I can.
If I could weigh in a little bit on the question as well, and I feel bad that I'm not just leaving as soon as I'm weighing in, but I do think there is a tendency to say, oh, well, if this scenario was wrong, therefore all studies that use the scenario need to be thrown out, or now just bad. Right. And I think it really depends on how the scenario is used, right? If you're looking at what are the impacts under a warming level of 4 degrees, or say even 4.3 degrees, I think was the original RCP 8.5. I don't think those outcomes are off the table. I still think they're worth looking at. I think we need to be clear that those are not the most likely outcome today. But those are, realistic tail risks that we should assess when looking at potential impacts from climate change. I think the criticism of the media is that, as I said earlier, and this is, the criticism of some of the climate science community as well, is for a long time people were conflating what was really, an unlikely worst case scenario, 4C warming by 2100, with the most likely outcome. And I think as long as we're clear about that, using scenarios that assess impacts at 4C global warming are completely fine, and in fact are an important thing we should do. But we should also look at, what's the difference between a 3C world, which is closer to where we seem to be headed today, or a 2C world, which is where we want to head if we're successful with climate policy.
Are you involved with the next IPCC round? Yeah, right?
Yeah. I'm a lead author in Working Group 1, and then Glenn, who wrote the piece with me, is a coordinating lead author in Working Group 3.
Richard, are you still IPCCing?
No, I did not even try to get in this round or previous round. I would disagree a little bit with Zeke. Definitely, if you want to sell newspapers a story that we're all going to die, or it's all a hoax, that sells, right?
Yeah.
But a story like it's not as bad as we thought, but it's still not good, that is not a good headline, right? And therefore, this is a bit of a shock to the media, I would think. But also, if you want to get your paper published in some journals, then a story, it is worse than we thought, is an easier sell than a story that perhaps it's not as bad as we thought, right? There's also competition between journals in getting more alarmist stuff out. and that actually goes. That is not just what the usual journals that we think of, but also there's in other areas there's journals that think like that, and this is a problem. And of course, what we have at the moment is that the new scenarios aren't out yet, right? And the old scenarios are still easy to get. So I think that for a long time in the future, we will get stories about RCP 8.5, and there will still be this tendency of some people. After all, we all want to get citations, we all want to get promotion, we all want to get research funding. And that is easier to get with a story that says it's worse than we thought, right? So it will be a while before this works through the system, I'm afraid.
Andy, can I make a couple of comments?
Yeah, of course.
So first, I want to positively shout out David Wallace Wells, who I think has written a couple of stories that almost exactly describe the nuance that Richard was rightly saying is hard to sell, and and this was after his book The Uninhabitable Earth came out, and I think he had every reason to be the journalist to kind of dig in his heels and double down, and he was one of the first to report on this. He did a long story in the New York Times called something like Beyond Catastrophe, that when it went to these nuances. So I think there are some examples of some very, very good journalists. Obviously, Andy, you've also been.
Although I have a slide where I show his best-selling book, The Uninhabitable Earth, on one side, and a kind of an imagined, re-envisioned cover of a book called The Somewhat Inhabitable Earth. And of course, one was a #1 bestseller in the New York Times, and the other would never get published.
But again, my point is well, I mean,
right? Go ahead. I want to make a related point. He, in his big cover story in the magazine, he also did a little bit of this attribution thing. He really built that story around because of changes that we have seen in the world.
Sure,
the world is no longer headed toward an overheating climate. So he was attributing it to the success of the messaging of him and the IPCC, the 1.5 report and the like. Yeah,
I believe he also talked to Roger and talked about Justin's paper, but I don't want to go too far in the weeds about
it's okay.
Story. But the broader point, I think Richard is right that there are a lot of incentives to sensationalize. I think there's also just a lot of, there's an easier path in for certain findings than there is in others. But I think related to that, and maybe push back on some of the narratives on the other side, is that I think a lot of the slow uptake and the misuse has been innocent. And I've really seen this in fisheries, which is kind of the field that I came from, where, what happens? Someone's trying to figure out, I have a model that understands how fish respond in their habitat based on the temperature. I want to project that forward. Okay, the scenarios, here's a bunch of them. I'm going to take the high one and the low one, right? and plot the difference. Or there's a downscaled version that I really need because I need to do it regionally, and it only exists for RCP 8.5, which I think is the case for some downscaled models. And so they take it, and they're not experts under the hood, and they run with it. And then the journalists do the same thing, right? The university press offices are great at distilling the nuance of a paper down to some pithy headline, right? And then the journalists take it and run with it. And my experience, I wrote a review paper for a fisheries audience, and gave a couple talks on it about the scenarios. And the reaction was overwhelmingly, oh gosh, we didn't realize we're going to stop. And in our paper, we saw that, after Zeke's and Justin's and our paper came out in kind of early 2020, you see a little bit of a change in the fisheries journals. That paper was in 2023. Anecdotally, there's been an enormous change. I'm on the editorial board of one of the big fisheries journals. There's been a huge change for the better in the last 2 years. So I think a lot of changes happening. The two types of doubling down that I do see a little bit of that I think are problematic in the scientific community and maybe a little bit in the journalistic community is number one is the kind of, Trump, we don't like Trump, so we want to say whatever is the opposite of what Trump says, right? And so if Trump is saying that this scenario is wrong and it was always wrong, we want to kind of pretend that that's not true, or pretend that there's, well, who cares that it's wrong because all the impacts are the same in all scenarios. And it's like, these are the same people who are saying every 10th of a degree matters, which contradicts that, right? And then the second type, which I actually think is more common, even though the first type is kind of louder on social media, is people who've built or think that they've built a lot of their body of work on the scenario.
Right.
And I think that they build is very important, because I think in some cases it's not true. So for example, in economics, there's a lot of incredibly good econometric studies that try to estimate some impact of climate change on something, and then they forecast it out with a scenario. And it's like the econometric estimate has nothing to do with what scenario you use, and it's still useful regardless of whether you're changing the scenario. And so it's less of a climb down than maybe you think. But I do think that Richard, please correct me if you think I'm wrong. It seems to me that economics has actually paradoxically been one of the worst fields in terms of sticking to RCP 8.5 misuse. And I'm not totally sure why. Maybe somebody just needs to write a review paper for them.
I think it looks worse because we're closer to it. But parts of economics have been pretty bad in this. Absolutely.
There are some reader questions, some listener questions that come in. If you have time, I want to tick through them before we close out, because they're pretty good. Here's a new one. Okay, so David Behar on LinkedIn says, he says David Wallace Wells stepped up big and early and did the right thing that might not have been in his personal interest. Big credit for him.
I agree.
I agree too overall, he's a friend. I like him.
Yeah, and he's talked to many of us over the years.
Yeah,
so.
No, he's taken this seriously. And David also said, do the panelists think that 7.0 provides a reasonable worst case scenario today? And do they also agree that we are roughly on a 4.5C pathway today? Asking from an adaptation planner friend.
Well, so we now have new scenarios. I think the new high scenario is more of a 6.5 watts per meter squared by 2100. It's not quite 7.0. It's a little bit more realistic in some of its assumptions around future population. Still not super realistic, and future coal use than 7.0 was. I think that is probably a reasonable, pressure test for high-end scenarios today, with the caveat, of course, that models running that are themselves going to have a very wide warming range. So you don't necessarily just want to take the multi-model mean and call it reality, because obviously climate sensitivity uncertainty is just as big as scenario uncertainty, even though we don't treat it that way in many cases. In terms of where we're headed today, that's a fun debate. I think the literature largely bears out that 4.5 is analogous with current policy scenarios. In fact, the new medium scenario in CMF7, or the illustrative ones they published so far, is more explicitly even tied to be thought of as a current policy scenario. But of course, current policies are an incredibly hard thing to actually model in the real world, because we don't know what's going to happen in the future. We don't know how much past policy work on technology is going to bear fruit going forward, or how much innovation is going to drive changes independent of policy. So I think it's not a bad place to anchor, but I think that we should acknowledge that current policies itself is a very fuzzy concept to try to precisely project.
I basically agree with Zeke. I have a quick question actually for Zeke about the new scenarios. Have you guys revised down some of the economic growth and convergence assumptions, or are we sort of hedging that to see what happens with AI?
So the official scenarios aren't coming out till September. So I can't talk about the underlying assumptions yet. I believe that the Van Buren et al. Paper did note that they revised down the population assumptions a bit in SSP3, which is the socioeconomics that underlie the new high scenario. But I don't know about GDP assumptions.
Okay, I'll keep on that hobby horse then.
Yes.
Can we tie this back to my original remarks? I was talking to a friend from China 2 weeks ago, and obviously we were talking about the Strait of Hormuz and that it was closed, and what are the implications, and were they terribly worried? And actually, what he told me is something that I should have realized. China is not just the world champion in wind and solar, it's also the biggest one by far in coal liquefaction and coal gasification.
Right.
And what they've done over the last month, 2 months, is turn those factories back on. And China is actually returning to coal and actually offering other countries, including Australia, some of their fuel because they have too much, right? And so a return to coal is actually at the moment China's policy in its way of dealing with the chaos that your president is causing.
So 2 quick comments. 3, I guess. That's fascinating, Richard. Thanks for pointing that out. So 1 is, I think I agree with Zeke's position on sort of where the high end scenario is, but I hope that climate researchers and journalists will note the difference between what he said the high end scenario should be and what he said current policies are, and they're not the same, right? And so if you're modeling business as usual versus worst case, you're going to do something more like 4.5 or something more like, say, 6.5. The second thing is economic growth. This is my hobby horse. The world has been tracking below GDP per capita projections from pretty much all the scenarios for the last 15 to 20 years. And it's not, people might think, oh, that's just 2008 and COVID. It's not. It's actually more in poor countries, the deviation, than in rich countries. And my basic hypothesis is that it's some wishful thinking in convergence, right? We really like to see a world where everybody grows and we converge and we become more equal. And I would like to see that world too, but it is not the historical pattern. And the other thing, we have a paper, Communications, Earth and Environment from a couple of years ago called Multi-Decadal Dynamics Project Slow 21st Century Economic Growth and Income Convergence, where we show that we're below the scenarios. And the other thing we show is it's not, if you think about AI might save us, it's not just that to get, to the high growth scenarios, it doesn't just have to change, it has to change immediately because of the way growth compounds. So if we, get to SSP5 growth because of AI in 2050, you've already lost half of the growth by 2100 and implications for scenarios. So again, this is my hobby horse. I'm not part of the IPCC. You can take it or leave it, but I really think that we should be moving down, or at least expanding the bottom of the range of economic scenarios, both for analyses of emissions and for analyses of adaptation, given the fact that places that are adapting the best and places that are reducing their emissions in absolute are overwhelmingly rich countries.
Well, that's a good point to keep track of. Again, the things that we think, the norms that we think are going to persist aren't always going to be the ones that do persist. Yeah. I want to close out with one question, and we could do this again, now that I've popped the blister. Here is a question from Jeffrey, who had a couple, but we're running short of time because I have to go play music in a while. That's as important to me as this.
Congrats on your new album, by the way.
Thank you. So Jeffrey says, how should the climate impacts community clean up the mess caused by misunderstanding, misinterpreting, miscommunicating the scenarios? Maybe our last round of thoughts from you, maybe Zeke, Matt, and then Richard.
Yeah, I think the easiest solution is just to move away from using emission scenarios as the basis for impact studies, period. Look at impacts under different warming levels, be clear the conditional nature of those impacts. Like you can say in a 4C world, this set of impacts happens, and in a 3C world, this set of impacts happens. If you want to say, what the likelihood of those worlds are, well, we don't know, but you can tie them roughly to the new scenarios and be clear that, under current policy, we don't get to 4 degrees until after 2150. In a, high scenario, we don't get there till 2120 or something, for the average of the scenarios. But obviously, the climate sensitivity is uncertain, so there is a risk under both the scenarios that we get there by 2100. I think we just need to get better at talking about these outcomes in terms of risks and uncertainties in the climate system, rather than these, predictable things that happen at a certain date, in a certain scenario, because we don't know it. And that's not really what's going to drive the uncertainties here. I think that would, clean up a lot of the mess is just switching away from using the scenarios, period.
Just say if you reach this temperature globally, this is the thing to think about.
So
Yeah.
in ecology, I completely agree with Zeke. In economics, I think it's often more complicated. So for example, if you're projecting, there's a Nature paper, I think about a year ago, that tried to estimate how does temperature affect crop yields, accounting for adaptation, which is related to development. If you project that forward with the scenario, you have to make an assumption about what happens to the economy. And because what happens to the economy affects emissions, I think you do have to explicitly consider those, as opposed to like animal range limits. Who cares why it's 3 degrees, right? In terms of your original question, Andy, I would just say we need to, number one, look what's under the hood, right? If you're a user of scenarios, get to know them, just like you get to know your study system in any other context. And then as much as we can, try when we're doing studies and we're communicating, just think about what is true and why, and try as little as possible to be politicians. I think scientists are terrible politicians. Even if it was right for us to be politicians, I think we're very bad at actually making our political change that we want. But I think, worry less about the narrative and more about the truth would be my pithy advice.
That sounds like good advice. And Richard Toll.
I think the 2 previous speakers are a bit too optimistic about human nature. So one of the reasons that the 8.5 scenario was created was because climate modelers wanted a big signal, right? So that they could sort of like really test their models. And the same is true for impact modelers, right? I mean, a really high climate scenario, it's much easier to demonstrate the sensitivity of the system that you're particularly interested in. And it's sort of like a middling warming scenario is just less interesting. So that is one thing. Second thing is that whenever you publish a paper, you always need to compare your results to the previous ones. And if in the previous ones, RCP 8.5 was dominant, you need to show, even if you don't believe the scenario anymore, how your new model compares to the old ones under the same scenario. And that is another reason why 8.5 will be with us for a while yet. And of course, the third thing is that, what has been released so far is just a sketch of the new scenarios rather than the details of the new scenarios. So you simply cannot use the new scenarios for impact research because they haven't been published yet. So over the next 2-3 years, we will continue to see RCP 8.5 just for logistical reasons and for reasons of pipeline. But I'm afraid that it will be with us for a longer time than what is strictly necessary. Now, I actually don't think that this is the biggest problem in the climate impacts literature. I think that the biggest problem is that they assume that climate changes and that the rest of the world stays as it is or as it was in recent past. And we should move to a much more dynamic representation of these impact and these impact models. I think that is actually a much bigger fault in much of this literature. But I'm afraid that 8.5 will be with us for another 5, maybe 10 years in the impacts literature.
Yeah, a lot of momentum in the system. There's a lot of people watching, but I think we should try to reconvene another time. This one came up really quickly. These are great questions and answers. There's a lot more to say. Maybe later in the summer or maybe in the fall when the scenarios are actually issued, we can revisit. I did just post, David Behar had a suggestion. One suggestion the question we just talked about was ensure enough simulations are done by the models for mid-range scenarios. There's a long history of 2.6 and 8.5 realizations dominating the CMIP output. But I think that gets at what you were saying earlier about you want experiments that force the model. So it reminds me of El Nino and El Nino and La Nina years are easier for weather forecasters to predict because there's a bigger nudge to the system. This has been great, and thank you for
And Andy, I would note one final thought in closing is this might hopefully be the last time that we're stuck saying 2.6 and 4.5 and 8.5 like these numbers mean things to anyone, because thankfully in the new scenarios we've moved away from naming them after the radiative forcing level in watts per meter squared in the year 2100. They are now the very low, low, medium, and high scenarios.
Wow,
Simple
what a
names.
cool! There's hope for the world. There's hope for the world. So thank you, Matt Burgess. Thank you, Zeke Hausfather. Thank you to Roger earlier, and thank you, Richard Tol, for coming on. This has been illuminating. I hope you'll all share it. It'll be on Substack, like the video will be there. It'll be on YouTube, LinkedIn, etc. And anyone who's watching can dive back in and get the details and share away. Thanks. This is Sustain What, and I'm going to go off to the Kitchen Junket, where we make music every Monday and have a potluck jam. I think climate scientists could use more of that potluck supper as a way to overcome some of the tricky things. Thanks all.
Thanks, Eddie. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for having us.
Take care.
Bye-bye.